Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Lapointe. I'm the Director of Land Conservation at Essex County Greenbelt. And on behalf of the organization, I want to welcome you all to our webinar on climate resiliency planning. I particularly want to start by thanking our partner on this project, the Office of Coastal Zone Management, who is supporting this work through a grant through their Coastal Resilience program. So we're extremely grateful for their support and their partnership on this work. Here with me today are Abby Hardy-Moss, our conservation planner and GIS manager, Dave Heacock, our geographic and technical support specialist, and Vanessa Johnson-Hall, our assistant director of land conservation. Our project manager, Maggie Brown, is also working with us today and will help with some questions. I'd love to start just really quickly with some housekeeping and some detail about how the webinar will go. The way that we are going to run the webinar is that all of you will be muted, not because we don't want to hear from you, but we will mute you. And our methodology for getting questions and feedback from you is to for you to click on the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. So if you're unfamiliar with this technology, if you simply bring your mouse down to the bottom of your screen and hover over the bottom, a toolbar will pop up. There's a Q&A button there in which you can type questions. We're going to take Q&A at the end, but don't wait until the end to submit your question. If there's something that seems to be extremely timely, we will try to take those questions within the flow of the presentation. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end. You'll see that you have options for minimizing the speaker window, or you can click and drag it so that you can see the slides better. Again, back to the Q&A, if you're having any technical issues, just submit your question in writing and Maggie will help you with that in writing. We're going to try our best to keep this to about an hour and finish up around 1. And the webinar is being recorded, so we will have a link and the slides will be available afterwards on our website at a special page dedicated to coastal resilience. So I'll just tell you all a little bit about Greenbelt. I was looking at the list of folks who are here, and I think many of you know us. We know many of you and are really glad to have you here. But for those of you who don't know Greenbelt, we are the land trust of Essex County. We serve all 34 cities and towns in the county. We've been around for nearly 60 years. And in that time, we've, in partnership with many of you, have protected nearly 18,000 acres of land. Our primary mission is to protect land for wildlife habitat, working farmland, and scenic value. And hopefully during this unusual time of pandemic, many of you have had an opportunity to get outside and enjoy our properties throughout the county. With that, I will turn the presentation over to my colleague, Abby, who's going to start things off.
So hello, everybody. I'm Abby Hardy-Moss. And I'm going to just start off here by going through what the goals of the project were. So we started this project nearly 2 years ago. And at that time, we decided that it was time for us to do a new prioritization analysis. We had done them before, but the last one was nearly 10 years previously. And we had been interested in climate change at that time, but there really wasn't nearly the data available that we needed to complete that sort of analysis. And so this time around, it was really important for us to be able to really focus on climate change and climate resiliency in this project. Another area we really wanted to look at, which is related to climate change, was drinking water. We knew that was an important issue, protecting drinking water, to a lot of our municipalities and partners that we work with. And so we definitely wanted to focus on that. In addition to a lot of climate data that's now available, a major change with this project was that there was new standardized parcel data for the entire region. And that made this project much more feasible and much more usable ultimately to conduct at a county scale than it had been the last time we did this project. Another major change was that in the past, when we'd done these kinds of projects, we'd really done it primarily as a tool for Greenbelt to use. And so, of course, that was going to be a goal this time as well. But we also knew that we wanted to be able to share the data like we're doing today and be able to hopefully have it be a tool that would be useful to others, municipalities, other land trusts, or other nonprofits or planning agencies. So very quickly, just a quick visualization of how these kind of mapping analyses work. The image on the right is kind of just visualizing what this process looks like. So we use our mapping technology, GIS, to take different data layers and stack them up on top. You essentially use a parcel boundary like a cookie cutter to cut those different resource values and assign points for whatever happens to fall within the parcel. Questions that we look at during this process are, what areas are important for us to look at, what resources are important to protect, and then what data is available. Just because there's a certain area that we want to look at, just like 10 years ago with climate change, the data may or may not be available. The process for the project, as I said, it's been about 2 years. The first year we got funding from the Tort Sustainability Foundation, New England Biolabs Foundation, and through the Land Trust Alliance and Open Space Institute to fund a GIS fellowship, which Dave Heacock completed. We later brought him on as full-time staff. That was a year-long project, and that phase of the project, we had a staff committee where we focused our different areas we wanted to analyze, and then we did a lot of research on different methods, other projects that folks had done, different studies, and then we ran a lot of tests to see what worked and what didn't work. Once we had some good draft data, we reached out to an advisory panel that we put together of experts and practitioners in related fields of study. They then reviewed that data and some methodology information we put together and gave us feedback. Once we integrated that feedback, we applied for and received a coastal resiliency grant through the Coastal Zone, the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, which is what we're working under right now. During this project, we're doing a bunch of different climate change resiliency focused projects. But for this part, we conducted outreach with the town of Essex and the city of Gloucester. We shared the data and maps with them, and they gave us feedback on the different analyses. And so we then incorporated that feedback into the data and into the different analyses, and that's where we're at now. And so they've been finalized, the data has all been finalized, and now we're moving into a phase of broader outreach with other municipalities and partners and sharing of information. So once we got through that process, we ended up deciding on focusing on 6 different areas, which you see here. Today, we're really focusing on the climate change analyses, and so those are the ones in red here. And my colleague Dave Heacock and I are going to go through each one of these and give you some examples, show you some parcel-based results and kind of how they come together. But I just wanted to point out here that we do have data and results in addition to the 4 climate resiliency analyses: urban cooling, natural resilience, flood mitigation, and drinking water. We also have results for habitat and agriculture. And we're happy to talk to folks about those analyses and share data on that. So you can just contact us if you're interested in that information. We'll have our emails at the end of these slides. And as Chris mentioned, we'll also have information on that webpage that we posted at the beginning. So on that webpage, we are going to be posting in the next couple weeks a long methodology document that has complete information about all of the data sources that were used in this project, as well as the different methods and the way that we put things together. But this here is just some examples of the data that we used in this project. Again, we'll illustrate some of those data sources with some individual parcel scores. So I'm just going to go through our natural resiliency analysis. This analysis, really what it is you can think about it as a habitat analysis, but taking climate change into consideration. So which parcels are going to provide the most biodiversity with a changing climate? The way that this analysis works, the darker the purple, the better score it had. So what I'm going to show you here is a active project that we're working on in Ipswich. This is Cayman Farm. And so just to kind of show you how this project worked and how the scores kind of come together. So this farm here, you can actually see there's two areas of it to the north and south of the road. The northerly section is actually made up of a number of parcels, which is why part of it's covered in purple and part of it is not. The red boundary is kind of the complete project area. So that northerly portion of the property, a number of those parcels got a high priority score for natural resiliency, and to the south, it got a priority score. So the data that went into those scores was largely coming from the Nature Conservancy's resiliency data set. This is data that they've been developing over about 10 years. It looks at terrestrial or upland areas that will continue to provide a lot of biodiversity with the changing climate, as well as coastal areas. So this is that data for this area. And you can see on the northerly parcel, there is a large area of above average terrestrial resilience or good areas for upland climate change and biodiversity. The southerly area of the project has more slightly above average, which speaks to why the southerly area of the project scored a little bit lower. Another data source that we used was adjacency to open space, or really open space density. How much other open space is nearby a parcel? And this was important to us because if a parcel is near larger areas of protected land, that can provide more biodiversity. And so in addition to the Nature Conservancy data I showed in the last slide, this property has a lot of nice protected open space nearby, which just helped it get a little bit higher score. So now I'm going to pass this presentation off to Dave Heacock.
All right, thank you, Abby. Let me do a change of a screen share here. Okay, hopefully that all looks good. So I'm Dave Heacock. I'm Geographic and Technical Support Specialist at Greenbelt and did a good bit of work on this project. And so I'm going to continue on with a few of the other analyses that we performed, prioritizing different parcels under a few different analysis modules. So we'll take a look first at flooding. And we kind of split that, the flooding analysis into both coastal and inland flooding, because that was just a little bit more straightforward to assess those two different types of land cover. With the coastal assessing, or I guess including more salt marsh areas where the inland areas weren't so much. And you can see the countywide results there for the coastal analysis, but also the inland analysis. And we'll look at some of the specifics again back at that Cayman Farm property, which we looked at under natural resilience. But that project also has a couple really well-performing parcels for inland flood mitigation. And so this analysis is trying to prioritize those parcels which have natural abilities, the land cover that they possess, to mitigate floodwaters. And how we evaluate that is first by assessing the flood risk that exists on the property. So within our inland model, we looked at FEMA data, the frequency of flooding, which you can see here, a large portion of the western part of the parcel and that southern part of the project have a high degree of overlap with a 500-year flood frequency within the FEMA flood data. Within our coastal model, we, instead of looking at FEMA data, we would look at hurricane surge inundation and the categorical intensity that model uses. And so we try to look at it from different angles, but here we can see at Cayman Farm there's a high degree of risk under the 500-year model of FEMA flooding. But this property also possesses really resilient wetlands in the western part, and also resilient forested upland and grassy field upland. And those areas, if they were developed, might cause some flood issues. So protecting these areas is helpful to mitigating this flood risk. And both from like a local habitat standpoint, but also from a human perspective. And so that does a good bit to assess the flood risk on, more of a present, current evaluation. But we also thought it was important, and something we heard through feedback, to, target more of that idea of, okay, if this were developed, what new flood risk might be apparent. And so one thing we incorporated was evaluating those areas which belong to a forest core, because through research of like forest hydrology and similar studies in the region, those kind of large forest cores have been shown to be really helpful to mitigating risk of flooding. And if they were developed, that would be a big concern for that topic. So we took some methodology here that was used in the Biomap2 analysis, if you're familiar with that, this idea of a forest core, kind of these large groupings of forest areas, and added value to parcels that contain large proportions of it. So you can see there's kind of this large forest block north of the road there in Cayman Farm, which it includes a large proportion of. And so that quantity of that forest core in that project was reflected in its high score. So that is a brief look of how the inland flood analysis works, and what kind of data was built into it. So we're going to jump now to the urban cooling analysis. And what this analysis aims to do is address the concerns of urban heat islands. And this was something that through part of the process we reviewed a lot of all the available MVP plans that were made from communities in Essex County, and a number of communities expressed heat-related concerns to human health specifically, and we wanted to incorporate that. So this would deal mostly with the idea of urban heat islands, which, if you're not familiar, is kind of this idea that areas with a large volume of impervious surface, developed areas of concrete and asphalt and buildings like that, that type of surface absorbs sunlight at a really high rate. And so those areas are normally hot because of that, and that can translate into really warm ambient air temperatures. And if there's hot weather rolling through, then it can make those areas even hotter. And people are using their air conditioning more, and energy rates increase. So it's a large concern in terms of climate issues. So urban cooling, what this kind of analysis aims to do is to identify those green spaces, like forest and vegetated areas, do a really good job of cooling air naturally. And so, if there are large forested or naturally vegetated areas within these abnormally hot areas, they can do a lot to cool that surrounding area, and make those areas much cooler than if they weren't there and were developed or something like that. So it's something we wanted to take a look at in our study region. And we're going to take a look at Lynn Woods, which really stands out there as a abnormally cold area in its region. And this is a project that Greenbelt has been partnering with the Department of Conservation and Recreation and the city of Lynn Woods to look into permanently protecting this area. So we will put a spotlight on it here. And that's just another look up close of the large volume of green space that is there, but then also surrounded by all this developed area. And there is the land surface temperature data, which we saw at a county scale a couple slides ago, but now at kind of a finer scale here. And so you can see those areas graduating up from like yellow to orange to red, with red being the hottest of those are the areas that were identified as the urban heat island areas in our community, those places which are abnormally hot compared to the rest of the county. And you can see how that correlates to the developed area. And you can even kind of make a sense if you look at those those developed areas that might show some heat island coloration abutting lindwoods. You can even kind of tell visually that they're cooler than they would be if lindwoods weren't present. And so basically what this analysis is doing is looking at these cool areas within these really hot regions, and elevating those which are having the strongest impact. But also with this kind of analysis being especially human oriented, we also wanted to incorporate environmental justice areas, those which reflect vulnerable populations in our communities, and as populations that are particularly vulnerable to the heat island issue. So if this parcel, Lindwoods specifically, you can see serves a community like that in its urban cooling properties. And it's kind of interesting to see the overlap between the environmental justice communities and that heat island area. So it seems to be an especially important parcel to speak to that issue. And finally, we'll take a look at the drinking water analysis. You can see the countywide results there, with the dark blue being the most valuable. And these would be areas which, through both their regulatory value, surface water protection areas, wellhead protection areas, as well as kind of their natural qualities, their presence in watersheds, those sorts of things, to provide clean drinking water. These are all things that we wanted to give value to and try to prioritize. So we're going to look at the Artichoke project up in West Newbury, which is one Greenbelt has been working on currently. And a number of parcels here around the Artichoke Reservoir show up as priority areas. Two of those parcels you can see are within that project. So we'll take a closer look at why that's the case. First off, you can see in this map we are showing surface water protection areas. So this shows a high volume of Zone A coverage within there. You can see that hashed blue area covering about half the property. And that runs just around the reservoir there. And this is just a small bit, but worth showing as a zone of the wellhead protection area. And it just covers a bit of the northern part there, but does influence the overall score of this parcel. But then on top of the regulatory aspect, we also did a little bit of data development on our end, and you can see we delineated a watershed here. And so that Artichoke Reservoir provides a lot of drinking water, and you can see that intake there where the water is actually pulled from, just on the top border there, that green dot. And so you can generate kind of a watershed shape around this reservoir to show those areas which supply water through runoff to that drinking water source. You can see that Artichoke project takes up a large volume of the watershed, but it's also really close to the reservoir, really close to the intake. And so that's something that drives up the value of the parcels in there, and seems to make it a really important piece of the puzzle to that drinking water area. And so that's just an example of how the analysis might work, and how we tried to look at the drinking water issue from a couple aspects. So I'm going to give the floor now to Vanessa, and she's going to talk a bit more about this artichoke project and some of the specifics to it.
Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa Johnson Hall. I'm going to review a case study of the Artichoke River Woods project, which will show how Greenbelt can partner with municipalities to preserve parcels that are local and regional conservation priorities. So let me see if I can turn on my annotate so I can highlight. So this in yellow, as you've been seeing, is the Artichoke River Woods property. This is 38 acres of mostly wooded area. Where it's not wooded, it's wetlands. All of the wetlands on the property flow to the upper Artichoke Reservoir, and it's a hill here, and that slopes down to the reservoir on the east side of it. This acquisition is a partnership between 2 municipalities, ultimately 2 state agencies, and Greenbelt. This project attracted all these funding sources because this land has significant natural resources that would be irreparably impacted by development. Greenbelt had 2 appraisals done on this property 4 years apart, and both found that this property could have a 13 house lot subdivision and a 1,600-foot subdivision road. And I'm sure all of you can imagine how that would impact the natural resources on the property. I wanted to show the aerial photo because it shows sort of the more apparent reasons why it's a conservation priority. It's got incredible connectivity to existing open space, which is one of the things that David and Abby talked about being one of the criteria they looked at. To the south, there's a town-owned conservation land that has a trail system on it. To the north, as Dave mentioned, this is a well water easement for West Newbury, and that right there is where the wells are for West Newbury's drinking water supply. Here's the intake that Dave pointed out for Newburyport's drinking water supply. Everything in this blue is Newburyport watershed land, and then to the north is Maudsley State Park. So this is a really important link in expanding local trails and a very important greenway. You can also see that this has about 1,000 feet of frontage on the Artichoke Reservoir. It's separated by just a very tiny strip of land that's owned by the watershed. So a significant piece of the property has direct impact upon the reservoir. As I mentioned, the Artichoke Reservoir is really part of the primary drinking water supply for Newburyport. It is also a drinking water source for West Newbury, and an important supplement for that town. So this is a really high conservation priority for both its recreational value and its drinking water, and you can see that just from the aerial photo. But next, I want to review again those maps that Greenbelt made through our priority analysis, further highlighting why it's a conservation priority. So you can see that it's scored really high in drinking water, critical priority, the sort of 2/3 of the property that's closest to the reservoir, high priority on the western side, because again, those are all wetlands that flow into the Artichoke Reservoir. From an inland flooding perspective, sorry, it's coastal flood mitigation, actually, not inland flooding. This is a priority for coastal flood mitigation. So keeping those forests intact plays a really large role in helping to mitigate flooding downstream. And that those flooding incidences obviously are going to become more and more of a threat as we keep having these higher intensity rainstorms, or we hope we'll get some rainstorms in the near future anyway. Let's see. And finally, I just want to look at the natural resilience, which goes back to the Nature Conservancy resilience data that Abby and Dave talked about. In this case, there's a very high functioning wetland on the western portion of the property. The natural resilience points to the ability of these wetland complexes to continue supporting biodiversity as the planet warms. So these are sort of some of the behind the scenes reasons why this rises to the ranks of being such a high conservation priority. And then last, I just want to emphasize, if you can go to the next slide, Dave, how closely funding sources are tied to a property's critical natural resources, particularly and more so as they relate to climate resiliency. Those characteristics that make it a high conservation priority attract funding. One indication of that is the number of partners involved. This project has already been awarded a state drinking water supply grant, and for the obvious reasons that this property has such direct impact on drinking water supply for 2 municipalities. We are hoping that there will be CPA funds from 2 municipalities that will be approved towards this project. But I put MVP, the Municipal Vulnerability Plan funding, up there also. And while MVP funds are not being used for this project, I think it's safe to say that Newburyport's willingness to spend CPA funds in a neighboring town, which is unusual, to protect Newburyport's drinking water is a direct result of their MVP process, which no doubt highlighted the vulnerabilities to their drinking water supply from climate change. And then I just want to mention the state's land grant. This is the Local Acquisitions for Natural Diversity Grant Program. Again, this is not a grant that we are going for this project, but this grant program recently started including the Nature Conservancy's Climate Resilience Score as part of its ranking. So, and that score is a big piece of Greenbelt, the data that Greenbelt used to look at our natural resilience. So that is increasingly being looked at by state and even some private foundation funding sources for its ranking in the funding application pool. And so unless anybody has any questions, I'll pass it back to Chris, I think.
Thank you, Vanessa. I see there are questions coming in. That's great. Keep them coming. We'll. I've answered one of them, but I think we'll hold the discussion on the others until the end. And so keep those questions coming. Just sort of quickly to wrap up here. Again, many of you on the call have worked with Greenbelt in the past, and we certainly look forward to working with you more in the future. But for those of you who are sort of unfamiliar with how we interface with municipalities, there are a number of services that we provide. Obviously, in terms of the whole organization, we have colleagues who work in stewardship, actually taking care of our properties, and folks that work in fundraising and community engagement and events. Those of us who are on the webinar today are in the conservation department, and primarily we're working on new land protection projects. So typically we're working in partnership with communities in the way that Vanessa described our partnership with West Newbury and Newburyport at Artichoke River Woods. And when we're involved in projects like that, we're typically very involved as project managers, often negotiating with landowners directly, getting into contract, getting site control, then helping cities and towns with grant applications. So we're often in the position of helping to write and improve and craft grant applications in partnership with municipal staff and volunteers. And as part of that, the mapping capacity that we have can be brought to bear to make those applications stronger. We certainly do a lot of public outreach in terms of educating folks about conservation opportunities, educating folks about the importance of land conservation as part of a consideration in everyone's local area, and lots of other project support. Throughout the year in and year out, we have lots of educational opportunities ranging from our film and lecture series, which is a different theme every year, to very specific sort of targeted outreach and workshops that our department puts on, things like leasing your land to a farmer or how to deal with Chapter 61 issues. And there's a great variety. They're always changing, so be on the lookout for those at our on our website, and be sure to sign up for our e-news, which is probably the best way for you to learn about them. We're constantly being asked to help support local open space planning. That takes all different guises, from helping with, in some cases, with some mapping, sharing our priorities, sharing data, and increasingly that's a role that we're playing. We've been very involved in most communities' MVP plans, and we've been pleased to have been invited to those conversations. Finally, again, increasingly, now that we have the prioritization done and we have the availability of map products, we have increasingly been providing maps of the prioritization results for open space planning and for MVP plans. So many of your communities have already worked with us on that, and we only see that increasing. So this has really been, I think, a great overview, and I know that there are a number of questions that I want to leave time for. So I'm going to stop here, and maybe Maggie, are you going to help us understand or help feed us questions?
Yeah, we got a number of really great questions. So let's start going through them. And Chris, you addressed one in the Q&A, but I was thinking Abby and Dave could maybe touch on this a little bit more. It appears that there's an area at the Gloucester-Rockport boundary where the cooling area stops. So maybe you can talk about why that might be, and maybe talk to the smaller parcels in that area and how the smaller parcels affect the results of the analysis.
So I'll just kind of go over what Chris and I had responded. So, and Dave should jump in on this as well. But so Dave, can you go back to the urban cooling map? Sure. So all of these, of course, these analyses are done on a parcel basis. And so parcels, one thing I should have mentioned earlier is that only parcels 5 acres and larger were included in this analysis, just to essentially keep it to a certain scalability across the county. And so the question here is looking at this large blue parcel, which is adjacent to the hotter area to the south, which is essentially Gloucester's downtown. And so a couple factors come into play here. It does, the cool area stops at the town boundary there because the unit of evaluation is a parcel. And so this large parcel is largely Dogtown area. And so the sheer size of it is having a huge influence in the score, as well as to the impact to that hot area. It is a very large forested area that is close to a hot area. Another thing I mentioned in the comments here is that while Rockport has a hot area, you can see it there, it's much farther to the east. And so only parcels that are close to hot areas are being included. And then once you go over to the Rockport side, there are some smaller parcels. One limitation with these types of projects is that, parcel data is much better than it used to be, but it does have a variation in quality. And in some areas, particularly in some wooded areas where there could be some owner unknown areas and parcels that are unclear in their configuration, that can be a data limitation to these results, which is something that we're aware of, particularly in some specific areas. And the Gloucester and Rockport Woods is one of those areas, and that is something that we absolutely take into consideration when we're looking at this data at the parcel scale. Dave, is there anything you wanted to add on to that?
No, I think that was I think that sums it up. Some of the idiosyncrasies of some of the parcels can play a role, and with the urban cooling analysis specifically, it's really speaking to that ratio of a cold parcel with really hot area around it. And so, yeah, I think like Abby said, that Dogtown nature by virtue of its size and pretty close adjacency to that downtown area of Gloucester finds its way in, but it's probably more of an exception compared to like the Salem, Lynn, and the Lawrence, Methuen areas.
Could I chime in and just point something out again? This is a great question from Tom. So Tom knows the area well. For those of you who know either Lynn Woods or know Dogtown, I just want to point out we made a decision, even though those areas have a certain level of protection, or the majority of those parcels have a certain level of protection, they're so significant from a variety of natural resource perspectives, and they're occasionally to regularly the topic of some discussion and debate as to their protected status and stewardship issues and so forth, that we felt, at least for Greenbelt, because this is, you know, we were at least partly doing this for us, that we needed to include those because they're important to find ways to additionally protect, potentially with a conservation restriction, as we're doing with the city of Lynn and DCR. Maggie, not to take your role, but following on Tom's excellent question, Tom had a follow-up question, which is somewhat related to what was just asked, which is the question about, is there a way to aggregate similar adjacent parcels to evaluate them together? And he's pointing out the challenge we had with Woodland Acres in Rockport, which as we know was 75 tiny parcels, which we were able to protect in partnership with Rockport as a single 47-acre parcel. But from a parcel data standpoint, it doesn't exist that way on the ground. Could either of you speak to that?
Yeah, that is a tricky issue that we did consider and thought about trying to address that. We actually did for our agricultural analysis, because the scope of it at a county scale was, well, quite a bit of work, feasible. Ultimately, it was not feasible to do that with this project at a county scale. Although if we're looking at smaller areas, it could be. One of the factors that we looked at is it is possible with the parcel data available to us to combine data parcels rather based on common ownership. But without getting into a whole separate hour-long discussion on the parcel data, the ownership information associated with that is extremely variable when you start considering different trusts that are affiliated with ownership and all of that level of detail. It would be very haphazard as to which parcels got combined and which ones did not. And so we felt that it created too much of a variability in scoring. And so that would be the kind of thing that we could consider moving forward if we're evaluating an area at a smaller scale. But at the county scale, it just wasn't feasible for all 6 analyses.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Another question we have here is what tool and baseline data were used to develop the watershed boundaries?
That was done using the ArcHydro extension in ArcGIS desktop. So there's a plugin there, and there's a built-in processes of tools you can use, inputting a digital elevation model, and then we went through and hand selected those surface water bodies, you know, those ponds, reservoirs, portions of rivers, which we identified that serve public drinking water intakes, and then use those with the elevation model to delineate the watershed.
Great. Another question here. Are there plans to add this information and data to Oliver or the MVPC MyMap program?
Good question. So we haven't looked at adding it to Oliver, but we are currently working, partnering with MVPC to integrate it into their MyMap program. So we're piloting that with one community. We're working on that this summer. And then we've actually applied for another grant for next year that we're hoping to receive. And part of that project would be to integrating it in a more broad spread way with the MyMap program. So if anybody's interested in that, please, they can just follow up with me. I'm Abby. And you know, if you're interested in that for your community, just let me know and I can give you more information on that.
Awesome. Can one of you talk to the question on the relationship between upland forests and climate resiliency? The question is, how upland forest contributes to climate resiliency. If it does, why the Artichoke River Woods project rating on natural resiliency didn't reflect the value of the upland forests on that property?
That's a good question. So the upland forest, the forest block data that we developed for this project was really only used in the in that one analysis that Dave showed in the drinking water. So that was specifically looking at trying to kind of evaluate what could potentially happen when a large area of forest is cleared, to the impacts of that. So for the natural resilience analysis, the Nature Conservancy did their own analysis, which does include some amount of land cover, but really it's looking at more different factors that can predict biodiversity in a changing climate. And so particularly for inland areas, that's looking at data such as changes in elevation within a small area so that species can migrate to different microclimates during like a very hot event. They could potentially go higher in elevation. It's also looking at factors such as underlying geology and its ability to support different diversity and biodiversity above, that sort of thing. Coastal resilience data is looking at some different factors, but that would be for the inland analysis. So the Artichoke River Woods did score, it did get some points around the natural resilience, for the natural resilience ranking. However, that piece of the data was not included. We did include the adjacency to protected lands, but not the forest blocks for that data. And you know what, I just realized I misspoke. We included the forest block for the flooding data, not the drinking water. Dave, was there anything else you wanted to add on to that?
I don't think too much. I think you covered that well. And I think sometimes depending on the analysis, there's, I'd say natural resilience might be one that lends itself to larger parcels. And that can play a role in how one might score as a priority. So, but yeah.
And if I could just chime in too, I think the thing to keep in mind with a county level prioritization is the fact that, we're not saying that Artichoke River Woods is not important from a climate resilience standpoint, but compared to another 3,000 parcels in the county, it's relatively less important than some others might be. So if you were just looking at West Newbury and ranking the most important climate resilience parcel and the least important, you might have a slightly different result. But that is a feature of our county-wide process that you have. You've got to keep in mind compared to what. In this case, it's compared to a relatively larger sample size because we were looking county-wide.
Yeah, and while we did not include parcels, except for the agriculture analysis, we did include some smaller parcels, but for all the other analyses, while we cut parcels 5 acres and larger, there were still thousands and thousands of parcels that were included in this analysis. So, the parcels that are getting the priority and above levels are really the cream of the crop countywide.
Great. One of our last questions here touches on how people can access and view the analysis results. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, so we are sharing this data with towns. If they're interested in particularly integrating it into open space planning or MVP planning processes, we're working with individual towns to make maps for them to include in those plans and that kind of thing, to help support their open space planning process, but also if there is a project that comes along that they want to apply for a grant application. We've been getting feedback from a variety of grant programs that identifying a property in these analyses will help different grant applications, we'll maybe give a couple points. So we want to be able to help towns on that level. So if a town is interested, they can certainly contact us. Again, our emails are on this page. We are hoping to kind of increase that outreach in the next year or two. And so we're already in conversations with a number of folks, but if we haven't started that, just contact us and we're happy to talk to you about that. Also, if as a part of a project that we are currently working on with a town, we're certainly happy to make these maps for those projects. We do a lot of partnered projects. And so, you know, for land grant applications and that kind of thing, that's something that we can assist with. And then I think there was another part about data sources. That methodology document that I mentioned that will be posted on the website, the webpage here that's listed at the bottom, that methods doc will be posted at that spot, and that lists all of our data sources. So if anybody has any questions about that, again, I'm Abby, please feel free to reach out to me or Dave, his email is here as well. And we can assist you with finding the data sources that you need.
Great. Well, that's all of our questions in the Q&A right now. Does anybody have any concluding thoughts?
I will just, I started off, so I guess I'll finish up. I really appreciate you all joining us today. We've covered a lot of territory in a relatively short amount of time. I'm glad we were able to keep on schedule here. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of detail here. There's a lot that if any of you are interested in really doing a deep dive, either in the data or the methodology or in, you know, your local community, we're happy to do that. Please feel free to reach out to us. Again, we want to thank the Office of Coastal Zone Management for their support for this outreach and for this work. And we hope to see you all soon, and please reach out. And thanks very much and take care.
Great. Thank you all.